Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody, Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, co-host of the show, Kevin Gordon, joining us from DC this time. Kevin, glad you're here, and how's DC?
It's good, and it's kind of summer-like weather today, but we're here on the day the president will be delivering his State of the Union address tonight. I guess if you call it that. A speech before a joint session of Congress. There's lots of media about it, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the developments today.
Very exciting, thanks. And joining us, a somewhat frequent guest on the show, founding partner at Capital Advisors, Barrett Snyder, joining us. Barrett, glad you're here.
Thanks, Tim. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so let's start in DC since you're there, Kevin. Biden is putting out a big announcement today. It's going to have a lot of impact on education and families. Could you just tell us a little bit about what we know so far about that announcement?
Yep, another nearly $2 trillion package. The folks in Washington, D.C. seem to like a number around that level. So I think it's about $1.8 trillion actually that the president's going to be announcing. And he calls it an effort to create the best educated or the best education that we've had in a generation, educational opportunities in a generation. So the themes around childcare, education, support, it's wrapped around a family's agenda is what he will outline tonight. A lot of it has already been released. We will be doing, in fact, Barrett's going to be heading up the advisory that'll go out to our clients today, getting into a little bit more detail. We'll probably have a little more detail on it next week, but really, really big investments, probably the biggest investment, a single investment, and all of it that I think affects us directly in terms of our kids in K-12 will be the $200 billion investment in universal preschool, ultimately impacting the kids that we serve that matriculate up into K-12. But there's just a lot of other pieces to this, big billion-dollar packages around education, the notion of 2 years of community college for free, which California has led the nation on getting a jump start on that under Governor Jerry Brown, and we've continued that effort to try to make community college more affordable for folks. But a lot of other components to this very, very ambitious package. It is coupled with tax increases. The whole package will be one of those things that's going to be a difficult overall package to get through Congress. We suspect it'll probably have very high positive sentiment from across the country. If you take a look at the tax increase the president's proposing, the slight increase on marginal rates is about a 2.5% increase on marginal rates, but then also a big tax increase for folks at the very top are what we always call the 1%. But all of it ultimately gets down to whether or not they'll be able to get the votes, what the politics will be in the U.S. Senate. Is this the kind of thing that you can only get done on a straight party line vote? And if not, what does he have to give up to get Republicans to cross over and support some of the package? So at the end of the day, what really makes a difference to our friends in Washington, D.C. is what people are saying back at home. So as citizens, sort of look at this, voters look at this and express their sentiment, you will see Congress move in a direction one way or the other. But again, Republicans all across this country usually solidify their base with an anti-tax stance or a more conservative stance on these kinds of issues. And folks that are left of center solidify their base by being very much in favor of what the president's proposing. So interesting stuff, big impacts to education overall. No question about it, the biggest investments I've ever seen in my lifetime in education, in children and families. Big, big, big package today. Anything you wanted to comment on, Barrett, on this?
The only thing I'd mention is that what the president appears to be doing in his proposal is basically adding, bookends to the education system. We're putting basically two years on the front end with universal access to early learning in preschool, and then 2 years of community college on the end of high school. And so he's just trying to expand out what all Americans in their mind should have access to, regardless of your income. So I just think it's interesting to look at it that way, and the way they're paying for it. And I think on the tax rates, they're proposing to essentially put them back to pre-tax cut levels in order to pay for it.
Yep.
Well, thanks, Barrett and Kevin. And I guess we'll look for more details on that through your email later, Barrett, and then we can cover some more details next week as more details are gathered. So thanks for that. Kevin, one thing that we've been getting a lot of good news on is revenues, and it looks like there's more revenue growth news this week. Can you fill us in on that, please?
Yep. So once again, for the month that just passed, Department of Finance put out a advisory $2.3 billion north of what the projections were in January, for a total of $16.7 billion ahead, not ahead of the budget that was passed that we're living with in the current year, ahead of the governor's own projections that he made in January. So to be that far ahead of his forecast that was just made in January this year bodes really, really well for what we will see probably at the May revision. And the reason why these numbers are important, I mean, people are talking about money in all kinds of different dimensions in public schools these days as a result of what's going on at the federal and the state level, the state's early action on the $6.6 billion package that they had. But the reason why these numbers are important is because they embody what could potentially be, increased money that's ongoing. So much of the money that we've been looking at is one-time money. So really good news here. There are probably some caveats, Barrett, in some of this, I guess, as well. And
Yeah. One of the caveats is that the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office had pointed out recently that this is potentially going to trigger an arcane provision of our Constitution going back to Prop 13 called the GAN limit. And that essentially says when state revenues exceed a certain level, that the legislature and the governor are essentially required to split that excess after a certain point between tax cuts or tax rebates, refunds, and education. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't want to use the word manipulation, but we're anticipating efforts by the legislature and the administration to try and, maybe not give us everything we're entitled to under this GAN limit dynamic. But we'll see. We're definitely going to be playing defense on that and analyzing proposals to make sure that schools are getting what they're owed under the GAN limit. So we'll have more analysis on that when we see what the administration's proposals are around what they think revenues are going to be, what folks think about their interpretation of the GAN limit and how they're going to use it. So in our budget workshops, we'll dig into this pretty significantly, I suspect.
Right. Yeah. There are some interesting implications to that. There are some tax expenditures that don't count toward the GAN limit. I know they're going to try to look under every rock to try to avoid having that thing get triggered, or at least minimized. But they actually had projected that it did get triggered in the January budget, but the cost overall of what the obligation was to the state's general fund was rather low. It looks like it's going to be a bigger number now. Yep. And so I thought about it, Barrett, as you talked about, what the legislature does when they work overtime to analyze how they balance a budget, is even though they'll have that challenge, there are other things they can do on different components of the budget to balance things out for education, because I just don't think we end up with some big giant windfall that they don't help sort of adjust our numbers somehow under Prop 98 to compensate for. I think it also bodes ill for the long sought effort that I've been doing this whole year to get the supplemental payment honored, which would be to stick by the legislature and governor's commitment in the current budget to up the Prop 98 base permanently going forward by $12.5 billion over a multi-year period. The governor does have one-time adjustment this year in there, but the idea that we were hoping for, which is to make that permanent, or to keep it permanent since it's already in the law, the governor's proposed repealing it. I think the larger the amount of money that we could end up benefiting by under this GAN situation, the political sentiment to try to do something even more for education in the midst of all this other stuff going on, I think is going to be a lot harder.
Yep.
Well, thanks, Kevin. And Barrett, we're glad you joined us today because there's some bills that are being debated right now, kind of working their way through. But the first one I wanted to ask you about was the non-classroom based charter school reform bill. Can you fill us in on that? Like what, just a little overview and the progress or where that sits?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's AB 1316 by Assembly Member O'Donnell. I think a lot of folks know, he's the chair of the Assembly Education Committee. The bill specifically deals with two things. One, it's proposing to reform essentially the entire non-classroom based charter school space, everything from authorizations and oversight to functionality, auditing, professional development, but also independent study. Per the pandemic, I think independent study has been drawn into this debate because non-classroom based charter schools have to use independent study to claim attendance. So the bill is comprehensive. It's what we refer to as a full Christmas tree with ornaments on it, meaning it's got a lot of provisions in it. It's big. It's a 185-page bill. It's robust. The author is taking a stab at significant reform. This is on the heels of some language that was included in some prior legislation that created a moratorium on the authorization of additional non-classroom based charter schools for 2 years. That's going to expire next year. And so they're under the gun to get something done before the moratorium goes away. We were supposed to spend last year having this conversation, gearing up to have a conversation around non-classroom based charter reform, and then the pandemic hit. And so one of the casualties of COVID was this non-classroom based conversation. So it feels like a little bit of a scramble here to do a lot of this stuff. So we'll see. I want to be really clear what this bill is not doing, though, because we get a lot of questions. There's a separate question about what are we doing for distance learning next year? And these two things touch each other because, independent study reform is proposed here. The reforms are not being proposed for next year. It would be effective 22, 23. But the issues touch each other, but they are separate conversations. So this bill is not intended to deal with whether or not we're doing distance learning or what distance learning looks like next year. That's a separate question that's likely to play out in the budget. This is specifically dealing with reform, and it's across the board. I mean, there's things in this bill that deal with vendor contracts. So some of the stories around a lot of homeschool charter schools that essentially give parents a couple grand to go spend on enrichment activities, and then they're spending them on well-documented trips to Disneyland and sometimes religiously affiliated tutors and other things. So there's an effort to crack down on that. Looking a lot at authorizer oversight. So, districts and county offices that authorize these non-classroom based schools, what they're required to do in order to get their oversight money. A lot of this is coming off the A3 debacle down in mainly the San Diego area, where some small rural districts authorized some charters that essentially committed fraud and people went to jail and there were some bad things. And so a lot of this is in response to that, and specifically some of the feedback from the San Diego district attorney that provided the legislature with some recommendations, and a lot of them are in this bill. So the bill today is up in Assembly Member O'Donnell's committee. In fact, it's going right now. So that's no surprise this bill is going to get out of his committee. But it'll be the first opportunity where we see potential shifts in the bill. There'll be some committee amendments, so the bill's going to change as of today. We're going to provide a full analysis of that with the changes for folks. But this is going to be one of the bigger bills this year because they're under the gun. I will say that this is a proposal from the Assembly. It is not a proposal that has universal buy-in from members and staff on the Senate side or within the administration, but they have been talking to each other. So I think they realize that this is an issue they got to work on this year. It's going to be big. There's sort of a clock ticking, but there's not, the administration and the Senate have not bought into this bill as of yet. So we'll keep everybody posted and provide more analysis.
Thanks, Barrett. Yeah, we'll look forward to those updates. And the other bill I think we wanted to discuss here was AB 104. It's about retention. Can you fill us in on that bill and what it's about?
Yeah, and then Barrett knows as much about this as anybody, but we had Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez had this piece of legislation. It's touched off a lot of response from school districts around the state about, and I think her intention was, look, we've got the pandemic going on. How do we make sure that we're giving families and kids every option to make sure that they recover, educationally from this? And so reached out to try to head in a particular direction with that legislation, and got a major blowback from school leaders all across the state in terms of their really, really big concern about retention policies generally. And that's what's kind of an underlining kind of aspect of the legislation, is the notion of retention. And we think there are going to be changes to this. The other issue is everybody knows that it's AB 104, but the reality is, or is it 107, Barrett?
104.
104, yeah, 104. And so it sort of got that bumper sticker on it, but very, very likely, at least what we hear, to end up being something that gets negotiated with the administration is maybe something other than a bill, budget language, the effort to try to just address this issue somehow. But it's been extremely helpful, the input that we're getting from superintendents and principals, education leaders across the state, about some of the thinking that's embodied in the legislation. So we try to help the legislature to do the right thing. Heart's in the right place. Maybe the approach is not one that really works so well, and we just need to make sure that policymakers understand that.
Thanks.
Yeah, and
go ahead,
I just want to add that the bill, and looking it up this morning, it's stuck in the Senate Rules Committee, which is interesting because that means this bill is going to run the clock out on meeting some legislative deadlines. So that to me says the bill's either dead, or they're going to need some rule waivers, or what I think is most likely is what Kevin's setting up, is that this is about ready to jump from a bill conversation to a proposal from the administration of some kind. I suspect Linda Darling-Hammond, who is well aware of, I think, the impacts of retention on kids, will want to maybe temper this a little bit. That's the feedback we're finding with legislators resonates the most, is that, wait a minute, I get parents maybe want to come in and say, I want to hold my kid back. But when you talk to them about the impact, particularly for older kids, there can be some significant negative impacts on retention policy. So when you have that conversation, folks tend to back up and say, okay, maybe we got to let educators have a little role in this too. So, but watch for that potentially in a revised conversation.
Thanks, Barrett. Yeah, and I just wanted to transition over to the tech side of things for a moment. There's a big news story this week about off-campus speech. And there was an incident back in 2018. A student posted something on Snapchat, some profanity. It was relating to the school that she attended. That actually was, the student was given some disciplinary measures by the school, and that was challenged by the student and the parents. That has made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think this is even more important of a debate now, simply because we have so many people that are learning and working from home. And this becomes a very interesting challenge for you as a leader to try to navigate, what is our behavior expectations of our students to be able to post, anything related to our school. If you haven't taken a look at your policies around that, probably a good time to revisit, perhaps over the summer, work with some legal counsel, work with the good folks over at Site, and try to think through this for your school district, and also communicate to your community what your expectations are. I think, over communicating these types of things is a great way to avoid some of these types of troubles. And I wanted to make sure everybody kind of called their attention to that, added it to their list of things to think about perhaps over the summer. So, Kevin, we have more news this week. Is kind of a big one on the recall for Governor Gavin Newsom. Can you tell us a little bit about the latest there?
Yeah. So, I mean, most people feel like, and I think even the governor's folks who have acknowledged this kind of privately for weeks, knew that this was all headed toward qualifying. There are some technical things that could end up tripping up the effort by the proponents of a recall, but it's very unlikely to happen that it would get stopped. So right now they've got the signatures, the overage of signatures. The Secretary of State sort of validated that this week. It's got a lot of big headlines. But one of the things that we just wanted to note was that take a look at the politics of this recall this time, and the distance in terms of the time between this qualifying and the actual election, which will be sometime in November, I think just gives the governor a huge advantage here, because things are going his way. You take a look at what's the general mood of the public relative to the fiscal condition of the state. We're not going to be looking at budget cuts. We're going to be looking at big economic growth, honestly, that just happens just by virtue of the fact that as we climb out of a COVID environment, there's only one direction you can go, and it's up. All of these things are going to help him. And then the other thing that he's probably pretty excited about are some of the interesting candidates that are emerging that would want to run for governor. And the more this thing looks like a circus, the more that accrues to the benefit of Gavin Newsom. So yeah, he'll be facing a recall election for sure, but the likelihood that he gets kicked out of office, I think, is very, very slim. Now, the other wild card is you just never know in politics. There could be some awful summer that we have with power shutdowns or mismanagement of a fire season, or anything can go wrong. It's just all about a lot of characteristics that sometimes a governor can't control. Just ask Gray Davis. And so you become the victim of kind of what your circumstances might be, in addition to political sentiment. So we'll keep watching that one, but interesting news this week.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. We'll definitely keep our eye on it. And like you said, there's some, let's just say, colorful news stories about this. So definitely an entertainment factor there as well. So one other big news story out this week on the tech side is the chip shortage. We've talked about it certainly early in the pandemic. It was hard to get devices. People have been ordering a lot more things that use chips, and frankly, there aren't enough chips being manufactured in the world to supply to meet this demand. So the CEO of Cisco Systems, 85% of the world's internet traffic travels across Cisco switches and routers and those types of things. Basically said for the next 6 months, they're going to be behind. And the reason why I'm bringing this up to you now is because typically school districts will work over the summer to upgrade their infrastructure, their networks, to get ready for the fall. And if this chip shortage, that 6 months carries us all the way out to October. So if you're thinking about doing something this summer, do not wait. It's very likely that you're going to be in a queue to get the stuff that you need, and try to be a little bit more proactive on some of those bigger investments that you need to make this summer to meet that demand when people come back to school in the fall. So keep your eye on that, and we'll keep you posted as any new events arise there. And Kevin, I finally want to wrap up with redistricting. Got some census news this week, and what does that mean for California?
Yeah, I mean, with that, the recall story and a lot of this other stuff going, it's just a really big political week. So yes, the U.S. Census Bureau coming out with their numbers, those being validated, and us discovering that California will indeed lose one congressional seat. So we'll still have the biggest congressional delegation in the country for the state of California, but we'll lose one congressional seat. And it looks like it'll probably be out of Southern California, which then makes, every member of Congress, whether it's two Democrats sitting right next to each other or a Democrat Republican, whatever the case might be, people start looking at each other. And it does sometimes force, as it did 10 years ago, a couple of incumbents to end up running against each other. And it can be really messy politics, but there's a real trickle-down effect to politics at every level. So redistricting affects every elective office, obviously, when we've got seats that are portioned by population. So yeah, lots of interesting fireworks around that this week. I will tell you this, that there is some noise being made about looking into a little more deeply the potential of a dramatic undercount amongst Latinos. And again, that's one of those things that we try to foster and support the idea of making sure that we're counting everybody. The state of California did a really good job of trying to make sure people understood the importance of being counted in the census. So it has yet to sort of bear out what that might look like, but there are issues there.
Well, thanks very much for that, Kevin. And yeah, we'll, like you said, it could turn into quite a mess down there in Southern California. So we'll keep our eye on that for everyone. And Barrett, just want to say thanks for being on today. Any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
Nope, just waiting for this May revision to come out. That seems like the next big moment of change and discussion.
Okay.
A lot of stuff riding on that.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to that. And that's a great time to mention the budget workshops that are coming up in May. If you haven't signed up for them yet, please go ahead and do so. Those are offered through your County Office of Education. You'll learn all about that May revise, and lots of great information there. Kevin, any final thoughts before you wrap up?
Nope, that's it. You get all the right plugs. Oh, there is that Jack O'Connell is doing his Brokers of Expertise on the 3rd of May. If you haven't registered for that, come to our website at capitaladvisors.org. That's capital with an OL. and sign up for the brokers of expertise. It goes over best practices of what districts are doing in terms of expending some of the big sums of federal money federal and state money that they have on some really great ideas. In fact, this thing is so well subscribed. We've got over 1,000 people signed up for it that he's probably going to do another, maybe a second or maybe even a third installment, because the idea, and we've got so many great ideas and stuff that people are working on. And it's not that you're going to agree with any one of them, but at least you get an idea of the array of things that superintendents and districts are thinking about doing in the districts with some of this money. And it also gives you a sense of what's allowable. So thanks, Tim, for letting me plug that.
Yeah, no problem. And make sure you take a look at the links. They'll be below the YouTube video, so you can go ahead and click on those there. The articles, the events that are coming up, and then in the email that goes out to the Capital Advisors team as well. So thanks you both for joining, and you have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next week.
Great. Thanks, Tim.
So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.